So good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Can I just acknowledge Peter Reynolds? Can I just say that he's doing a marvellous job on your behalf. He's constantly in my office and on the phone to me, lobbying on your behalf. And also to Darius Singh, who I just found out that our children play on the same basketball team. So another close contact that I will have now. As was just mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in the sector. I've met with many of you trying to understand some of the issues. I've had the portfolio for about 6 or 7 months. And as you all know, it's a very complicated sector. The funding model alone is very, very complicated and about to become more complicated. So I've spent a lot of time in centres. And the one thing I wanted to say to you was, I am so impressed with the amount of passion and dedication that you have to young people. And to the educational needs of our young people. The pride that you have when I go into centres and you show me, all of our toys are made from natural products, and this is the kind of philosophy that we have, and this is how long our teachers have been here, and the amount of pride that you have in your centres and the service that you provide is absolutely mind-blowing. And the fact that you have such good relationships with your families as well, and from some of the comments that were made today about how much you know it'll impact on those families if you have to up the costs, and how much you know each of their circumstances, is a testament to how close you are, not only to the children but to your families, and it's been amazing to see. And I know that, and some of you have complained about it, that you get sometimes a bad rap in the press, but from my experience, the vast majority of the sector is doing an absolutely incredible job, and your passion and dedication, can I acknowledge it? We've talked about some of the challenges, and the staff challenge was the first thing I wanted to talk about, because it's the first thing people say to me when I walk in the door. And it is extremely challenging. Now, the Minister has gone some way today, because I was going to say to him, I implore you to up those hours, the discretionary hours, and he's done that, which is fantastic. The border exceptions that have been announced today for teachers, 300, I've had a quick look, because I wasn't aware of it until I walked in the room, but I have had a quick look. It doesn't talk about MIQ spaces. It talks about a border exception so they can apply for visas. What it doesn't talk about, as far as I can tell, is MIQ space. Now, MIQ space, as we all know, is booked out to the end of the year. So it's all very well to have 300 teachers coming in, maybe a third of those to ECE, but how quickly are they going to get here? So that's something that we will push back on to make sure that they are putting aside some of the space in MIQ for those teachers. I'm just making sure that is the case with the Minister, because it is very difficult to get MIQ space at the moment. Some of the other things that we can do right now is take a look at the immigration settings, because every time I go into a centre they say to me, we're losing teachers to the regions because they can get more points to leave Auckland. But we have a massive teacher shortage in Auckland, and yet we're losing teachers because they can get more points elsewhere. That has got to stop, and it's not a particularly difficult fix in that regard. And then we need to think about how we make it easier to get ECE teachers back into the profession after they've had a family. We need to commit to a short-term supply package to encourage people back into the workforce. We have to speed up the police vetting. That's another thing that you've all told me, and I've been putting pressure on the police minister about that, but 6 weeks for police vetting is absolutely ridiculous. And I know it's causing you a lot of dramas and headaches, and I can see that they're looking at taking away potentially that period of time that you can have someone in your centre that hasn't had a police vet, which is concerning, which we'll push back on as well. And of course, in the long term, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we do need to look at teacher pay, and there has to be a bit of research on the reasons for the burnout and anxiety. Admittedly, a lot of it is caused by the fact that we've got a teacher shortage, but there are a lot of other things, a lot of other factors going into that as well. Ratios, children with complex needs who aren't getting the assistance quick enough, and often turning up at schools without any intervention because it takes so long, and that is all on your sector to look after. An overburden, this thing that's coming through a lot, an overburden with compliance and paperwork and regulations, and that you're having to employ a person just to do that job when we need to be focusing on children and ratios and actually teaching rather than this overburden. Pay parity is part of that puzzle, or increasing teacher pay is part of that overall puzzle, but it's not the only answer, and certainly right now it's causing a lot of problems. But we need to look at the wider reason for why teachers are leaving the sector and why they're not coming back. Just touching on compliance, the one thing that I'm struck by whenever I walk into an ECE who say to me, we've just had Aero in, and they look like they haven't slept in a month. It is, from what I can tell, an extremely stressful and anxiety-causing time when you've got Aero in. And it feels like, from when I'm talking to centres, that has gotten worse, and I'm not sure as to the reason for that. But the complaints are that they're spending days rifling through papers, ticking boxes, finicking over little details like we don't have an up-to-date driver's licence for this particular teacher, and then almost as an afterthought, oh, let's have a walk through your centre. And they're not interested in all the amazing things that you do over and above their box ticking. They're not interested in your philosophy or the fact that you're doing this for these particular children, or having extra resources in this particular area for the children. They don't seem to be interested in that. They're more interested in box ticking exercises and the paperwork in the back room. And that has come through loud and clear to me, and something that I think needs to be looking at. Just going to pay parity. I'll skip over a couple of things. I want to talk about pay parity. It's a mess. This is a mess. This is not a good situation for any of you. We have expectations of teachers have been massively raised. We have a situation where now centres are being pitted against teachers almost. You are in a no-win situation. As the Minister even said, you're between a rock and a hard place. What do you do? And I've been saying this for a while now, and I've been getting this feedback, and that of course you want to pay your teachers more. Of course you feel like you need to opt in. But what you're paying teachers, you're going to have to give up somewhere else. Now, either that's going to be increasing fees for your families. Some of you can afford to do that, some of you can't. And what my biggest concern is that it will reduce quality. Because you will be, and you already are, because I know, because I've spoken to many centres who've said, we're looking at our ratios. And they're almost in tears saying, we don't want to do that. We pride ourselves on the fact that our ratios are so good, but that's where we can move. So we're trading off teacher pay for quality education, and that is a real concern. It worries me that we've just passed, or we're just about to, pass the legislation giving the Minister the mechanism to do this without any consultation prior to that bill coming to the House. It blindsided the sector, blindsided us, and the fact that there was no consultation prior to that, and even not on top of that, it's been rushed through under budget urgency. So there was 2 weeks for the sector to put in a submission on that bill, and from that period we've got another 2 or 3 weeks to pass the bill. So it is extremely tight timeframes for something the Minister claims to be a very technical, small, don't worry about it bill, we'll think about it down the track. But the issues around it are significant, because as we heard today, you will not have the ability to decide where your staff start, and it will be based on tenure and not performance. And so those are 2 things that were never discussed, that never came up in the committee. The only reason they came up was because I asked about them and said, what terms and conditions from the Kindy agreement will be placed upon you? And the Minister said, absolutely none, that's not my intention. But as it turns out, well, the pay scale, there are 2 conditions that were never talked about, were never discussed until we asked officials who came clean and said, oh, well, there will be these conditions around the pay scale that will mimic the Kindy agreement. So using language to get around the fact that they are actually going to be the same as the Kindy agreement. And that's really disappointing. In a model that's supposed to be a high trust model between the sector and the Ministry of Education, it feels like this hasn't been open and transparent. There hasn't been enough time for discussion, and we find ourselves now in a situation where you're not happy at all. I can see by the hands in the room that you're not looking to opt in, or even though you desperately want to, or you will, but there will be compromises on quality. And I'm sure that the Minister, and I know the National Party, above all, the things that we always look for and want to promote in ECE are participation, equality and affordability. And I'm really worried that those will suffer because of the underfunding of this pay parity agreement. So look, I think the Minister has said in the past, he certainly said at committee, that the funding model is broken. And I think that underfunding and trying to wedge in pay parity into a broken model that he says he's looking at fixing, in fact when we left office we were also looking at a review of that, is probably the wrong way to go. But I'll leave it there, just because I know you're short on time, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions before I take off.
Thanks for your kōrero, Erica. It's actually very commendable that you have a commitment to early learning, and the whole sector is very interested to hear a little bit more about some of the questions that will be presented to you from the floor. I've just got a question to start off with, and then we'll roam around and send some mics around for people to ask their questions as well. Some of the long-term issues we face, like decoupling of kindergarten and centre teacher wages, started several years ago under a national government. What assurance can you give us today that National would support small businesses and help bring back some fairness and transparency to our sector, should you be in power?
Sure. I rang a couple of my old colleagues last night, because I actually don't know the history, because I haven't been around that long, of the kindy pay rates and the ECE pay rates. And I was talking to Dr. Nick Smith, and I said something that Peter had mentioned to me, that the rates were the same and then they started diverging. And he said actually it goes a long way back, years and years and years before that, when we started to fund ECE centres, because they weren't funded. We started funding them, and the rates were always below. So it's been a historical anomaly, and I'm not saying it's the right thing, but it's been a historical anomaly that has increased over time. And look, we absolutely support lifting teachers' pay to be more in line with the kindy teacher rates. But there is a way of going about doing that, and forcing the sector to cough up the money to do it by reducing the quality is not the way to go about that.
Thank you. Now I realise our time is nearly gone, and we're going to invite everybody, including yourself, to join us for afternoon tea, but we'll just take a couple of questions from off the floor.
Kia ora. Hey, I was just wondering, you were talking before about burnout of teachers. I think everyone in this whole room feels pretty pressured with compliance. I think ERO and ministry visits aren't adding to that. I think they just are part of all of that. I think the biggest problem within the sector is actually these cowboy relief agencies that are actually not regulated. They are taking our teachers, they are paying them more, and even when pay parity comes in, these guys are just going to continue to add pressure. Okay. So what is going to be done to regulate those people? Because they are killing us.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, the first thing we need to do is increase the supply of teachers so that you don't have to rely on them as much. And the Minister mentioned that there are some things underway, but actually we need a long-term workforce planning strategy in order to get there, and there isn't one. So that's the first thing that we need to address, is a long-term. And look, the Minister has mentioned that there are, additional people coming through, but whether or not that'll be enough to meet the need, no one knows, because we haven't got the long-term working workforce plan. But in answer to your question about whether or not we regulate the industry, look, that's not something that I've actually had a think about yet. It's not something that's been brought up with me, but I'll certainly take it away and have a think about it.
They are the ones that are taking our teachers.
Yeah.
So all that's happening is, instead of having the same teachers in front of the children every day, we have got 5 different people, and we have got vacancies that have been open for over 6 months.
Yeah.
And we can't fill them because these other teachers can go and work in an agency and not have to come to staff meetings in their own time, and not have to do anything other than get their body on the floor.
Yeah,
that's not what we want.
No, I totally understand. Thanks for bringing it up, and I'll certainly look into it.
Can I just add to that? You've got a survey on at the moment that we're running, and we've added some questions to that survey on this specific point. It's our intention to gather your experiences with relief agencies that are charging like wounded bulls, with a view to going to the Ministry of Innovation, Business and Employment and asking them about price gouging.